Here is a longer, heavier version of Hook 1. Still cold, tactical, and narration ready. No filler, no emotion inflation. They couldn't destroy the pillbox. They couldn't flank it. Every frontal assault ended with Americans dead in the dirt. So one U.S. soldier stopped trying to break the fortress. He studied it and turned the enemy's only escape route into a death sentence. For 4 hours, Company A was frozen in place at Fort William McKinley. 11 Japanese pillboxes had already fallen that morning. The 12th stopped everything. It sat on elevated ground, reinforced concrete, twin heavy machine guns covering every approach. Any movement from the east, south, or north was met with overlapping fire. The geometry was perfect. The Japanese gunners didn't need to see targets. They fired into spaces men had to cross. The first assault lasted seconds. Men went down before they reached 100 yards. The second attempt used smoke and suppressive fire. The wind shifted, the guns opened again. More bodies. By midday, 12 Americans were dead. More were wounded. No ground had been gained. Artillery couldn't be used without killing their own men. Flanking was impossible. Waiting meant stalling the division's advance and losing more lives to attrition. From a shell crater 100 yards away, Private First Class Manuel Perez Jr. watched the pillbox continue firing, methodical, patient, untouched. Command saw an unsolved problem. Perez saw a structure. The pills went down without thought. 30 white tablets, 90 milligrams of methamphetamine, 9 times the maximum single dose allowed under Finnish military protocol. There was no decision, only mechanical failure, frozen hands, thick gloves, and a body already past exhaustion. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, at approximately 10:25, Covenant felt the change. His heart rate surged violently, pushing past 180 beats per minute. Blood vessels constricted, pupils dilated. The snowfield around him sharpened into unnatural clarity, every shadow edged like glass. The sensation of cold disappeared entirely. This was not stimulation, it was override. Methamphetamine crossed the blood-brain barrier and silenced the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for judgment, planning, and self-preservation. What remained was a body running on chemistry alone. Covenant began to ski, not toward the rally point, not toward friendly lines, not toward anything he could later remember. His skis hissed through the powder at a speed that made pursuit pointless. The Soviet patrol heard him pass one man moving far too fast through terrain that should have crippled him. They did not follow. Men who move like that do not survive long. Covenant did not stop. For the next 14 hours, he skied without food or water. When his mouth dried, he ate snow. His pulse climbed toward 200 beats per minute and stayed there. His core temperature rose even as the air remained 15 degrees below zero. Methamphetamine had severed the body's thermal regulation. The furnace burned without breaks. By nightfall, he had covered distances that entire ski units struggled to reach in a day. His legs worked like pistons. His breathing fell into a mechanical rhythm. Thought vanished. Memory did not form. Sometime in the darkness, he lost his skis. Whether they broke, whether he removed them, whether he simply forgot to put them back on, the record does not say. Covenant had no memory of the night. Only movement. Only momentum. A human body functioning long after every safety system had failed. Perez didn't ask permission. He didn't explain his plan. There wasn't time. At mid-afternoon, he left the shell crater and began moving alone. He crawled low through brush and broken ground, advancing during machine gun bursts and freezing when the guns went silent. Every movement was calculated to noise, shadow, and timing. Halfway in, 4 Japanese soldiers spotted him from a secondary position. Perez rose to one knee and fired without hesitation. 4 shots, 4 men down. He reloaded and kept moving. By the time he reached grenade range, he could hear voices inside the pillbox, calm, routine, confident. Perez pulled a Mark II grenade, pulled the pin, counted. He threw it through the firing port and didn't wait for the blast. The explosion inside the confined concrete chamber forced an immediate decision: stay and die, or run. Perez sprinted around the pillbox, rifle up, straight toward the tunnel exit. He wasn't chasing survivors. He was taking position, and he knew exactly where they would appear. Perez hit the ground at the tunnel exit and waited. Seconds passed. Then, boots on dirt, the first Japanese soldier burst from the darkness. Perez fired once. The man dropped. Another followed, then another. Each emerged alone, silhouetted, panicked, predictable. Perez fired methodically, reloading without looking, muscle memory taking over. The tunnel became a conveyor belt. 8 men fell in front of him in less than 2 minutes. Silence followed. Perez waited, rifle steady, counting time. When no one else came, he moved toward the pillbox's front. Smoke drifted from the firing ports. Inside, wounded men were still alive. One charged him with a bayonet. Perez deflected the strike, lost his rifle, seized the enemy's weapon, and fired it despite unfamiliar controls. When that failed, he closed the distance and finished the fight with blunt steel. When Perez exited the pillbox, the twin machine guns were silent. 4 minutes earlier, 160 men had been trapped. Now they were moving forward. 18 enemy soldiers lay dead, killed not by firepower, but by a decision forced at the right moment. The battlefield fell quiet, but the war did not slow down for Perez. His commander counted bodies and wrote reports. 18 confirmed kills, 1 man. A position that had stopped an entire company neutralized in minutes. The advance resumed the same afternoon. Objectives that were expected to take days fell within hours. Paperwork followed the action. A Silver Star was recommended. It was rejected. The quota was full. So the commander bypassed the system and forced the truth upward. Witness statements were gathered. Distances were measured. The ground was photographed. The story could not be ignored. Perez was awarded the Medal of Honor. He never knew. 29 days later, he was walking point on patrol. A Japanese sniper waited in a palm tree and fired once. The bullet struck his head. Perez was 22 years old. The men he saved kept moving. The division kept advancing. The war continued. Perez's trap worked exactly once. That was all it needed to do. The Medal of Honor citation lists distances, times, and enemy killed. It records the action. What it cannot record is the moment the gun stopped firing. For 4 hours, that pillbox owned the ground. Men died trying to take it. Then one soldier understood that fortifications don't fail from force, they fail from human behavior. Perez didn't overpower the enemy. He predicted them. He forced a choice, controlled the exit, and ended the fight in minutes. 1 grenade, 1 position, 1 result. 29 days later, a sniper took his life. No last stand, no warning, just the cost of being the man who always walked first. But on February 13th, 1945, 160 men walked past a bunker that should have killed them. They walked because Manuel Perez Jr. bought them silence. That is what victory looked like. The war moved on without pause. Company A advanced through the breach, stepping past concrete, smoke, and bodies toward the next objective. No one stopped to celebrate. No one needed to. In war, success is measured by movement, and movement had returned. Perez went back to being a rifleman. Same helmet, same pack, same point position. The men around him knew what he had done, but they didn't speak about it. They didn't have to. Every man in that company understood the difference between courage and solution. They had seen both, but only one of them ended the killing. Later, historians would count bodies and minutes. They would debate medals and citations. They would reduce the moment to numbers. But the truth is simpler. On February 13th, 1945, a factory worker looked at a problem no one else could solve and treated it like work. He analyzed it. He removed emotion. He applied force only where it mattered. And because of that, 160 men kept walking. War doesn't remember speeches. It remembers outcomes. Perez left one behind and paid for it with his life. Perez never called it a plan. He never explained it as a theory. He did what workers do when a machine won't run. He found the failure point. The pillbox was not defeated by strength. It was defeated by inevitability. Once the grenade went in, the outcome was already decided. The Japanese soldiers were not choosing between fight and surrender. They were choosing between two exits from the same result. Perez positioned himself where the decision collapsed into certainty. This is what most stories miss. Heroism did not save Company A. Understanding did. That is why the action feels so cold in retrospect. There was no chaos, no rush, no improvisation. Every movement followed the logic of stress, fear, and human reflex. Perez didn't gamble. He engineered. When people talk about bravery, they imagine running forward into fire. But the most dangerous men in war are the ones who stand still, wait, and let the enemy do exactly what they are designed to do. Perez understood that. That knowledge cost him nothing in the moment. It cost him everything later. But for the men who walked past that silent pillbox, the lesson was permanent. Sometimes survival doesn't belong to the strongest. It belongs to the one who understands the system first. What Perez understood that afternoon was not bravery and not even tactics in the narrow sense. He understood systems. Every battlefield is a system of pressures. Terrain, weapons, time, fatigue, fear. Most soldiers experience these pressures as chaos. They react to what hurts the most in the moment. Perez did the opposite. He stepped back mentally and asked a quieter question. What happens next? The pillbox was built to survive contact. Thick concrete, overlapping fire, elevation. It had already proven that it could absorb courage. What it could not absorb was prediction. The Japanese defenders inside were not fanatics immune to fear. They were trained soldiers following doctrine. Doctrine says that when the interior of a fixed position is compromised, you withdraw through the rear to continue the fight. Perez saw doctrine where others saw concrete. That is the difference between fighting the enemy and fighting the system the enemy lives inside. When the grenade went through the firing port, the fight inside the pillbox was already over. The explosion was not the killing mechanism, it was the trigger. The real weapon was the tunnel. The tunnel turned panic into movement, and movement into exposure. Perez did not chase the enemy. He let fear carry them to him. This is why the action feels almost mechanical when read afterward. There is no drama in the sequence, no hesitation, no moment of doubt. Soldiers appear, shots are fired, bodies fall, reload. Repeat. It reads less like combat and more like a process being executed. That is uncomfortable for people who want war stories to be about emotion. But war does not reward emotion. It rewards correct decisions made under pressure. The Army's paperwork struggled with that reality. Medals are designed to recognize visible courage, charging forward, standing tall under fire, refusing to retreat. Perez did none of that. He crawled. He waited. He positioned himself where the enemy would appear. His courage was invisible until the bodies were counted. Even then, the system hesitated. The Silver Star quota was full. The action did not fit neatly into the categories. It took a commander willing to force the facts upward, to insist that what mattered was not how the victory looked, but what it accomplished. And what it accomplished was simple: time. Fort McKinley fell in hours instead of days. The division advanced. The campaign continued. How many men did not die because momentum was preserved? No one can calculate that with certainty. War accounting does not measure absence. It measures what is broken, not what is spared. Perez himself returned to anonymity immediately. This is another truth of systems. They do not reward individual excellence for long. A unit that depends on one man becomes vulnerable the moment that man is gone. So the system absorbs him and moves forward. He went back to point position because proven initiative is always placed where risk is highest. The same qualities that saved others placed him directly in the path of a sniper's bullet. There is no irony in that. It is simply how the system balances itself. The sniper did not know Perez's name. He did not know about Fort McKinley. He saw a helmet, a silhouette, a first man moving through vegetation. He applied his own understanding of systems. Shoot the lead man. The bullet ended a life that had briefly bent the system in a different direction. That is not tragedy in the poetic sense. It is symmetry. After the war, Perez became a symbol. Schools, parks, chapels. These are attempts to freeze a moment that was never meant to last. They serve an important purpose, memory, but they risk misunderstanding the lesson. The lesson is not that Perez was exceptional because he was fearless. The lesson is that he was effective because he was analytical. He did not rely on strength. He relied on inevitability. He did not ask the enemy to make a mistake. He created a situation where the only possible responses were fatal. This kind of thinking is uncomfortable because it strips war of romance. It suggests that victory often belongs not to the loudest or bravest, but to the quietest mind in the dirt, watching patterns form. It also suggests something harder to accept, that many deaths in war are not the result of overwhelming force, but of predictable human behavior under stress. Fear compresses choices. Panic narrows vision. Training channels movement. Perez exploited that compression. When people say anyone could have done it, they are both right and wrong. Anyone could have seen the tunnel. Anyone could have thrown a grenade. But very few people, under that level of noise, exhaustion, and fear, are able to pause long enough to see the whole system operating. That pause is the rare skill. The men of Company A understood this instinctively. They did not talk about heroism afterward. They talked about the moment the guns stopped, about walking forward without being cut down, about the sudden quiet that meant survival. Silence is the most honest metric of success in infantry combat. Perez bought silence with 4 minutes of action and 18 deaths. That exchange is brutal, but war does not offer cleaner currencies. It offers outcomes and asks whether you can live with them. His father received the medal on a bridge between two countries. The symbolism is often emphasized, but the deeper meaning is simpler. Bridges exist to allow movement. Perez's action was a bridge between paralysis and advance, between being pinned and moving forward, between dying in place and surviving long enough to face the next problem. That is why his story endures. Not because it is inspiring in a comforting way, but because it is precise. In the end, Fort McKinley was not remembered for its concrete. It was remembered for the moment its guns fell silent. And silence, in war, is never accidental. It is built. Silence does not end a war. It only makes the next sound possible. After Fort McKinley, Company A did not become safer. It became faster. Speed is dangerous in its own way. Movement exposes men to terrain they haven't read yet, to angles not yet mapped, to enemies who have had time to prepare. The same system that had trapped them for 4 hours now demanded momentum in return. Perez moved with them, carrying the same weight, breathing the same air, stepping into the same uncertainty. Nothing about him marked him as different except memory. The men around him carried an image they could not unsee. A tunnel exit, bodies stacked, guns silent. That image altered how they understood combat, not as an endless exchange of fire, but as a series of problems that could be solved if you survived long enough to see them clearly. This is how experience propagates in war, not through doctrine manuals, but through moments witnessed at close range. A lieutenant may brief tactics, but a private remembers outcomes. Company A learned that fixed positions are not defeated by courage alone. They learn to look for exits, routines, habits. They learn to watch the rear. Perez had changed their pattern recognition. This is rarely captured in official histories. Reports focus on objectives taken, casualties inflicted, timelines met. They do not record how one action subtly reshapes the instincts of dozens of men who carry that lesson into future fights. Those ripples move outward quietly, influencing decisions that never make it into after-action reports. The irony is that systems resist remembering individuals even as they absorb their influence. Perez became a reference point, not a celebrity. Like Perez did. Watch the rear. There's always a way out. His name functioned as shorthand for a way of thinking, stripped of biography. That is how systems preserve what is useful and discard what is not. The Army did not change its doctrine overnight because of Fort McKinley, but small adjustments began appearing in field behavior. More attention to bunker layouts, more emphasis on reconnaissance under fire, more patience before committing men to frontal assaults. These changes were incremental, unofficial, and uneven, but they mattered. War evolves through accumulation, not revelation. Perez himself did not become safer because of what he had done. If anything, he became more exposed. Proven initiative draws responsibility, and responsibility draws risk. Men who solve problems are pushed forward to solve the next one. This is not punishment, it is necessity. Units survive by placing their most reliable decision-makers where uncertainty is highest. When Perez walked point on March 14th, it was not because he was expendable, it was because he was trusted. Trust is another currency war spends quickly. The sniper who killed him did not know this. He did not know he was ending a life that had bent the day at Fort McKinley. He was operating inside his own system, one defined by patience, concealment, and the simple rule of shooting the first man. His action was not personal, it was procedural. This is the part of the story people struggle with most. There is no narrative justice in it, no symmetry that comforts. One system intersected with another, and one life ended. The sniper did not win the war. Perez did not lose it. The system absorbed both actions and continued. After the war, memory attempted to impose order on this randomness. Medals, ceremonies, named buildings, these are efforts to slow forgetting. They serve a purpose, but they also sanitize. They turn decisions made under extreme pressure into symbols that can be displayed without discomfort. What is often lost is the cold clarity of the original moment. Perez did not act to be remembered. He acted to end a problem. That distinction matters. In civilian life, we often treat problem solving as something abstract, separated from consequence. In war, the consequences are immediate and irrevocable. There is no revision, no second attempt. Solutions are judged not by elegance, but by whether people are still alive afterward. Perez's solution worked because it aligned with human behavior under stress. Fear narrows options. Training channels movement. When danger erupts inside a confined space, soldiers move toward the exit they trust. Perez trusted that instinct more than he trusted gunfire. This kind of thinking is transferable beyond war, which is why it feels unsettling. It suggests that many conflicts, military or otherwise, are not decided by overwhelming force, but by understanding how systems behave when pressure is applied. Apply pressure in the wrong place, and nothing changes. Apply it at the choke point, and outcomes cascade. The men who survived Fort McKinley carried that understanding with them, even if they never articulated it. They learned that survival sometimes depends less on bravery than on restraint, on waiting, on letting the system reveal itself before acting. That lesson is expensive. It was paid for with lives on both sides. When Perez's father stood on the bridge in Laredo and received the Medal of Honor, the ceremony attempted to close the story. But stories like this do not close neatly. They persist in fragments, in habits passed down, in instincts formed under fire, in quiet decisions made later by men who remember a tunnel exit and the sudden return of silence. The bridge itself is an apt image, though not for the reasons usually given. Bridges are not destinations, they are transitional structures. You cross them to leave one condition and enter another. Perez's action functioned the same way. It moved Company A from paralysis to motion, from death in place to risk with purpose. He did not remove danger, he redistributed it. That is the most honest assessment of what he did. War does not reward purity. It rewards alignment between action and reality. Perez aligned his action with how people actually behave, not how we wish they would behave. He did not demand heroism from the enemy. He assumed fear and planned accordingly. This is why his story endures among soldiers, even when stripped of ceremony. It is not comforting, but it is useful. It teaches that understanding the system is often more powerful than opposing it directly. Perez is buried with honors. His name marks schools and parks. These are gestures of gratitude, and they matter. But the truest memorial is less visible. It is the moment, repeated countless times after, when a soldier under fire pauses instead of charging, looks past the obvious threat, and asks the question Perez asked, where does this end? Sometimes that question saves lives. Time softens most wars. It rounds the edges, smooths the violence, turns moments of terror into lessons that can be told without shaking. But some actions cast a longer shadow than others. Perez's did because it exposed something uncomfortable, that survival in war often depends on clarity more than courage. After the Philippines campaign ended, reports were filed, maps archived, and units reassigned. Fort McKinley became just another marked position on a completed operational overlay. On paper, it was solved. In memory, it was not. The men who had been pinned there carried a before and after line that no report could capture. Before, the pillbox was an obstacle no one knew how to approach. After, it was proof that obstacles could be dismantled without charging them. This distinction reshaped how those men looked at the battlefield. They began to see positions not as monoliths, but as systems with seams. Every bunker had an entrance. Every gun had a blind angle. Every defender had limits imposed by fear, exhaustion, and training. Once you learn to look for seams, the battlefield changes shape. Perez had taught them how to look. That skill is not dramatic. It does not produce heroic silhouettes or shouted orders. It produces pauses, stillness, men lying in the dirt longer than feels safe, because they are waiting for the system to reveal itself. That waiting can feel like cowardice to the untrained eye. In reality, it is discipline. Discipline is the quiet partner of violence. The war did not reward Perez with survival. That is another uncomfortable truth. Systems do not protect those who understand them. They consume them. The same clarity that allowed him to dismantle a fortified position placed him repeatedly in positions of exposure. He was trusted to see what others missed, and so he was placed where seeing mattered most. When the sniper fired from the palm tree, it was not a duel between heroes. It was a convergence of two systems of understanding. One man applied his knowledge first. That is all war ever decides. Afterward, meaning rushed in to fill the void. Medals, citations, names on buildings, these are human attempts to impose narrative on randomness. They are not lies, but they are incomplete. They explain what happened, not why it matters. The danger of memorialization is that it can turn method into myth, and myth into comfort. Perez's action should not be comforting. It should be instructive. He demonstrated that violence applied without understanding is wasteful. 12 men died, charging a position because they confronted its strength directly. 18 men died because Perez attacked its weakness. The difference between those numbers is not moral. It is structural. This distinction challenges the way many people want to think about war. We prefer stories where virtue defeats evil through effort alone. Perez's story suggests something colder, that outcomes often hinge on whether someone recognizes the correct pressure point. Pressure points are rarely obvious. They require patience, observation, and a willingness to withhold action until certainty emerges. In combat, withholding action feels unnatural. Everything pushes you to move, to fire, to respond. Resisting that impulse is one of the hardest disciplines a soldier can learn. Perez learned it early. Perhaps that is why his story resonates beyond its specific context. It speaks to a broader truth about conflict, that most systems fail not because they are overwhelmed, but because they are forced to behave in ways they were not designed to handle. The Japanese pillbox was designed to repel frontal assault. It was not designed to manage internal panic and forced evacuation. Once panic entered the system, its collapse was inevitable. This idea applies far beyond that battlefield, which is why it unsettles. It suggests that many struggles, military, organizational, even personal, are not won by pushing harder, but by understanding where pressure naturally flows and positioning yourself accordingly. Perez did not invent this principle. He embodied it under extreme conditions. For the men of Company A, that embodiment became a reference point. Long after the details blurred, the core lesson remained. When trapped, look for the system, not the enemy. That lesson likely saved lives later, though no one recorded it. War is full of unrecorded survivals. The silence Perez bought was temporary. Guns would fire again hours later, days later, weeks later. But that moment of silence mattered because it restored agency. It allowed movement where there had been paralysis. It reminded the men that they were not simply targets reacting to fire, but actors capable of shaping outcomes. Agency is the most precious commodity in war. Perez restored it not by shouting orders, but by removing one obstacle completely. There is power in finality. A position that is neutralized no longer demands attention. It frees mental and physical resources. It allows momentum. This is why his action had effects beyond its immediate body count. It accelerated the operation. Acceleration reduces exposure. Reduced exposure saves lives. The chain is indirect but real. When his father accepted the Medal of Honor on the bridge, he stood as a representative for something larger than personal loss. He stood for the uncomfortable truth that some lives are spent to restore movement for others, not because they are chosen, but because circumstances align that way. There is no fairness in that alignment. Perez's legacy is not that he was the bravest man on the field, it is that he was the clearest. Clarity under fire is rare. It is also fleeting. It appears, acts, and disappears, often taking the person who embodied it along with it. What remains is the shadow. That shadow falls across later decisions made by people who never knew his name. It appears in moments of hesitation that prevent wasteful charges, in glances toward the rear of a position, in the instinct to ask, where does this break? Those moments are invisible. They do not earn medals. They do not appear in documentaries, but they shape outcomes quietly. Perez's story endures because it reveals something most war stories avoid: that effectiveness is not always dramatic, and that survival often depends on those willing to wait, watch, and think while others rush forward. The long shadow of his action is not glory, it is understanding. And understanding, once learned under fire, is never fully forgotten. As the years pass, wars are often reduced to dates and arrows on maps. Campaigns become chapters, battles become footnotes, individuals dissolve into unit designations and casualty figures. Yet some actions resist that compression. They persist because they reveal something fundamental about how conflict actually works. Perez's action at Fort McKinley persists for that reason. It strips war down to its core mechanics. Not ideology, not patriotism, not even heroism. Mechanics, inputs, pressures, outputs, cause and effect, operating under stress. This is uncomfortable because it denies the comfort of moral simplicity. Perez did not defeat the pillbox because he was morally superior or because fate favored him. He defeated it because he correctly identified how humans behave when trapped and forced that behavior into a narrow channel. War is full of men who are brave. It is far rarer to find men who are precise. Precision in war is not about marksmanship alone. It is about timing, positioning, and restraint. It is about knowing when not to act until the conditions are fully understood. Perez did not rush the pillbox when others were dying in front of it. He waited long enough to see the system behind the fire. That waiting cost lives. That is another truth that cannot be softened. Every minute spent observing meant continued danger for his comrades, yet charging blindly would have cost more. This is the ethical tension that real combat imposes. Choices are never between good and evil, but between different kinds of loss. Perez chose the loss that ended the problem. After the war, military theorists would formalize concepts like kill zones, choke points, and behavioral prediction. These ideas appear clean and logical in textbooks, but in reality, they are born in moments like Fort McKinley moments when theory is forced to survive contact with chaos. Perez did not quote doctrine. He enacted it instinctively. That instinct likely came from repetition, training, and an ordinary working mind accustomed to diagnosing broken systems. Factory work teaches a certain kind of thinking. Machines do not respond to emotion, they respond to inputs. When something fails, you do not curse it. You trace the failure path. The pillbox was a machine. The tunnel was its release valve. By forcing that valve open at the wrong moment, Perez caused a catastrophic system failure. This way of thinking is often misunderstood as coldness. In truth, it is compassion expressed indirectly. Perez did not save his comrades by comforting them or inspiring them. He saved them by ensuring they did not have to keep dying in front of that bunker. Results matter more than sentiment in war. That lesson carries a heavy psychological weight. Many soldiers struggle after combat not because of what they felt, but because of what they did deliberately and with clarity. Decisions made calmly under fire can haunt more deeply than actions taken in blind panic. Perez lived only long enough to make one such decision, but others carried its echo for years. The men who walked past that silent pillbox knew exactly what had been done to secure that movement. They were not naive. They did not romanticize it. They accepted it because acceptance is required to keep moving forward. This acceptance is another rarely discussed aspect of war. Soldiers learn quickly that moral clarity is a luxury. Survival requires operating within ambiguity. Perez's action did not simplify the moral landscape. It sharpened it. It forced everyone who witnessed it to confront the reality that efficiency in war is often indistinguishable from brutality. That confrontation does not end when the shooting stops. For some, it becomes a lifelong internal dialogue. Was there another way? Could fewer have died? Could the same outcome have been achieved differently? These questions have no satisfying answers. They are the cost of understanding how systems truly work. Perez was spared that long reflection by the sniper's bullet. Others were not. When history remembers him, it often focuses on the Medal of Honor, the youth, the tragedy of his death. These elements make the story accessible. They allow distance, but the core of the story is not tragic. It is instructional. It teaches that war rewards those who understand inevitability. Once certain conditions are met, outcomes follow. The Japanese soldiers emerging from the tunnel were not unlucky. They were following the only viable path available to them under stress. Perez's role was not to fight chance, but to remove alternatives. Removing alternatives is the essence of control. Control is often misunderstood as domination. In reality, it is about shaping the environment so that outcomes converge toward a single point. Perez shaped the environment around the pillbox until every path led to the same end. That is why his action feels final. There was no prolonged firefight, no back and forth. Once the trap was sprung, the sequence could not be reversed. Control had been established. This kind of control is rare because it requires patience, observation, and confidence in one's understanding of human behavior. Most people act to relieve anxiety. Perez acted to resolve the system. His story endures not because it is dramatic, but because it is clean. Clean does not mean gentle. It means decisive. In the years after World War II, militaries around the world studied fortifications, bunker systems, and small unit tactics. Lessons were codified, diagrams drawn, procedures updated. Yet the most important lesson remains uncodified because it resists easy teaching. The importance of waiting long enough to truly see the problem. Seeing requires stillness. Stillness under fire is rare. Perez achieved it once. That was enough. The silence that followed his action did not last forever, but it lasted long enough to matter. It allowed movement, momentum, and survival. In war, that is the closest thing to success there is. When people ask why stories like this should still be told, the answer is not remembrance alone. It is preparation, not for war specifically, but for understanding how pressure reveals truth. Systems break where they are weakest. Humans behave predictably under stress. Outcomes favor those who recognize these patterns early. Perez recognized them in a crater outside a pillbox in February 1945. He acted. The guns stopped. The men moved on. That sequence is the story. Everything else, the medals, the names, the memorials, is an echo. War does not remember intentions. It remembers outcomes. Fort McKinley is remembered not for its concrete or its guns, but for the moment they stopped firing. That silence marked the end of a problem that had consumed hours, lives, and momentum. Everything before it was friction. Everything after it was movement. Perez did not change the war. He changed one moment inside it. And that is how most wars are actually decided. Not by grand strategy alone, but by isolated decisions made far below the level of maps and speeches. Decisions made by people who see clearly for a few seconds longer than everyone else. Decisions that compress chaos into certainty. Perez's clarity lasted 4 minutes. That was enough. The men who survived did not need to understand why it worked. They only needed to know that it did. They stepped past the pillbox, past the tunnel, past the bodies, and kept walking. War demanded nothing more from them in that moment. History later wrapped that clarity in words, geometry, tactics, prediction. But on the ground, it felt simpler. The guns stopped. Breathing returned. Feet moved forward. That is the true end state of combat. Not victory, not glory, but the ability to move again. Perez bought that ability once, at the cost of everything he had left to give. The system accepted the trade without comment and continued on its path. And somewhere down that path, men who never knew his name survived because one soldier understood that traps work better than courage, that behavior is more reliable than firepower, and that silence earned at the right moment is the most valuable thing a battlefield can offer. Nothing else needed to happen. There was no speech, no pause, no acknowledgement beyond a glance. War does not stop to recognize understanding. It only moves past problems once they are removed. The pillbox was removed. The line advanced. That was enough. Perez became part of the terrain almost immediately, another figure absorbed into the forward motion of men who had been spared. His name mattered less than the absence of fire. His presence mattered less than the fact that others could now pass through a space that had been lethal minutes before. This is how most acts of real significance end, not with celebration, but with continuation. Later, historians would assign meaning. Officers would write citations. Cities would name places. All of that came after, when distance made the event safe to examine. But in the moment itself, there was only function. A problem solved. A path opened. That is why the story endures. It reminds us that in war, effectiveness is often quiet, intelligence is often invisible, and the men who shape outcomes are not always the ones history expects to remember. Sometimes they are simply the ones who see clearly when everything else is noise. Perez saw clearly once. The guns stopped, the men moved, and the war went on. There is nothing left to add. No twist waiting at the end. No hidden meaning buried deeper in the facts. A soldier identified a system. He applied pressure at the only point that mattered. The system collapsed. That is the complete sequence. He relied on inevitability. When the grenade went in, the outcome was already locked. When the first man ran from the tunnel, the rest followed. Not because they were foolish, but because they were human. Fear obeys patterns. Perez trusted those patterns more than he trusted firepower. That trust is rare. It is also dangerous. Men who wait to understand instead of rushing to act risk being judged, risk being too late, risk dying without ever moving. Perez waited just long enough and no longer. That balance cannot be taught cleanly. It is learned only under pressure, which is why stories like this matter. Not as inspiration, not as patriotism, but as instruction. War rewards clarity. It punishes noise. On February 13th, 1945, clarity won once. 4 minutes later, silence followed, and 160 men walked forward. Nothing more needs to be said.